Hey, how's it going everyone? Welcome to the channel. Zach D Productions here, and I'm here for a list video. This is a top 5 list video, and this is one that I've actually been wanting to do for a little while now. And I thought it would be an interesting list video to make and talk about these bands. So for this video, we're going to talk about metalcore. Now, when it comes to metalcore, it's not exactly my favorite genre of metal, but I still do like it to some extent. Now, when it comes to the bands that I like from metalcore, these are mainly bands of the early 2000s. And with that being said, that's why this is going to be a definitive top 5 list, because it's not like there will be any other band to come their way into my musical journey, of course, given that I pretty much have all the metalcore that I need, of course. So yeah, so we're going to probably go from my least favorite to my favorite of these metalcore bands. And if your list is different than mine, that's totally fine with me. Just feel free to leave your list in the comments. So let's go ahead and get started with what I have at number 5. Now at number 5, I have All That Remains. Now All That Remains is kind of a controversial band, mainly just due to the music itself, and also Phil Labonte as a person himself as well. He can be kind of known as an outspoken individual, and claiming how All That Remains transcended metal with their album The Order of Things, which is just insane to me. I mean, that's just absolutely outrageous. But either way, I do think that overall All That Remains is a pretty good band, especially their early material, mainly those first 4 albums. You can't go wrong with those. I mean, that's when they were most metalcore, I think, and I think a lot of people can agree with that. The Fall of Ideals is probably my favorite album from the band, so if you're looking to check these guys out, check out that album, The Fall of Ideals. There's a lot of really solid tracks from that album, such as This Calling, Not Alone, Whispers, 6, The Air That I Breathe, just to name a few. Those are really good songs, but they have other very strong material as well. Now, in the 2010s, this is where the band kind of fell off, especially with the albums The Order of Things and Madness. These 2 albums are definitely their weakest material. They went a little more radio-friendly on these albums, but I wouldn't say the fact that the albums are a little on the mainstream side is not really necessarily what makes the albums bad. It's just, I guess, how mediocre the albums are and just the blandness of the albums. I mean, the songs on those albums are just not that interesting, needless to say. But on their last album, Victim of the New Disease, I do think is a step in the right direction for the band. And this was, of course, unfortunately, the last album with Ollie. May he rest in peace. He was a very good guitar player. And his work on this album is really good, and as well as the rest of the band too. I mean, the band went in a heavier direction on this album, and I'm not sure what this band's going to do next. I don't know if this band has any new music in the works or anything, but I mean, I haven't really heard anything about that as of this moment, but I do think that their last album is really good, and I think it's the best thing that they've done in a good number of years. But yeah, All That Remains, they have some good albums, some weak albums, and that's why they're at the bottom of my top 5, because, I mean, you can't get past those 2 albums, The Order of Things and Madness, which are just not very strong albums. And they also have some albums that are kind of on the okay side of things, such as A War You Cannot Win. I know some people like the album, and I know there's people that despise the album. For me, I'm kind of more in the middle of the for that. I think there's some good songs on the album, but yeah, it's definitely not one of their best. But yeah, a lot of All That Remains material can be kind of hit or miss, I guess. So that's why they're coming in at number 5. Now at number 4, I gotta go with Killswitch Engage. Killswitch Engage is definitely a solid band and probably an essential metalcore band. I mean, if you claim to love metalcore and not a fan of Killswitch Engage, I mean, you might as well not even be a metalcore fan, because I think Killswitch Engage are definitely an essential when it comes to metalcore. Of course, they formed in the early 2000s, and they're one of the bands that really mean something to metalcore. I mean, sometimes when people think of metalcore, this is a band that might come to mind almost immediately when thinking about the metalcore subgenre. But I think both eras of the band are really good, the Jesse Leach era and the Howard Jones era. Now, if I had to choose which era I like more, I would probably go with Jesse Leach's era. I know a lot of people would go with Howard Jones's era. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Howard Jones is a very good vocalist, but I just think his era has more filler songs than the Jesse Leach era. I just think that the songs overall in Jesse's era are a little bit stronger, but again, I think Howard Jones is still a very strong vocalist. He has some very good range to his voice and everything. And I think Atonement is actually one of their best albums, their most recent album. And I know some people, when they rank the Killswitch Engage discography, some people have that close to last for some reason. I don't understand why. I think that's a very good album, but it is what it is. I do think it is a very strong album for what it is. I mean, of course, when it comes to the Howard era, you can't go wrong with The End of Heartache and As Daylight Dies. As Daylight Dies probably being my favorite from his era. Very consistent band in the metalcore subgenre. I mean, even when Jesse left and Howard came to the band, it's not like they ever had a misstep or anything. It just seemed like they picked up where they left off, and, you know, no drastic change of style or sound or anything like that. Very consistent band in metalcore. So Killswitch Engage, pretty good band, and they're at number 4. Now, at number 3, I gotta go with As I Lay Dying. Another band that I would say is essential for metalcore listeners. Once again, if you claim to love metalcore, I mean, you ought to be a fan of As I Lay Dying for sure. They're one of those bands that I just think does this subgenre so well. And I think they're one of the best in the genre. Obviously, they're in my top 3. They are one of the first few metalcore bands that I got into. And Tim Lambesis, obviously a very controversial individual. I mean, there's of course people that have walked away from As I Lay Dying due to the situation with Tim Lambesis, but there are people that are willing to forgive him and acknowledge that he has changed as an individual and he's not happy with, of course, what occurred years back. But yeah, I mean, I am a believer in second chances personally, so As I Lay Dying, definitely a very solid band. I think most of their work is good. Really, the only thing that I don't care about from this band is their debut, which I think is their weakest. And that's something that I've noticed with a lot of metalcore bands. It seems like a lot of metalcore bands' debut album is their weakest. And that seems to be a trend with metalcore. I'm not sure why that is, because in a lot of cases, the debut is a lot of bands' strongest material. Now, obviously not all bands, even outside of metalcore, that doesn't apply to all bands, but you know what I'm saying. It just seems to be a trend that I've noticed with a lot of metalcore bands, but everything else from the band is very good. I mean, I think An Ocean Between Us is their best album, at least in my opinion. That was actually the album that got me into the band, and I think their latest album, Shaped by Fire, is a very solid album and a very good comeback album for the band. Once again, another more consistent band in metalcore. Now, yes, ever since Shadows Are Security, they kind of had their established sound. I mean, I think ever since then they started adding in more melody into their songs and whatnot. And when they released Shaped by Fire, it just seemed like they just picked up where they left off. And that's something that you can't deny deserves respect for sure, keeping that consistency going. So As I Lay Dying, very solid band, and I think Tim Lambesis is one of the best harsh vocalists, scream vocalists in metalcore. So at number 2, now to be honest, number 2 and number 1 do go back and forth for me sometimes, but at number 2 for today, I gotta go with Demon Hunter. Now, when it comes to the Christian metalcore scene, Demon Hunter is probably my favorite in the genre, and really the only band that I listen to in that scene. I just think that they're really the only band that does it right. I personally find a lot of Christian metalcore to be kind of mediocre and kind of edgy and just unoriginal in general. But Demon Hunter is a very solid band, definitely the standout. I mean, definitely a unique band in the genre too, and I would say that they are the band that got me into metal and metalcore and all that, so definitely a band that does mean a lot to me. Now, if it wasn't for the nostalgia. Like, for nostalgia reasons, I would have this band at number 1. If I was making this list based on bias and nostalgia, then I probably would have Demon Hunter at number 1. But for the sake of putting my bias and nostalgia aside, I'm putting Demon Hunter at number 2. Definitely a solid band, though, and Ryan Clark, one of my favorite vocalists in modern metal. I think he's got a very good voice and a very underrated vocalist, I'd say. Definitely not a vocalist that's getting the attention that he deserves. Just the amount of range that he has in his voice and the emotion that he has in his vocal delivery in a lot of Demon Hunter tracks. But yeah, definitely a solid band. I mean, when it comes to my favorite albums from the band, I mean, The Triptych is a fan favorite, and that is one of my favorites from the band. True Defiance is another favorite of mine for sure. Extremist is another favorite of mine, actually. I don't care what anyone says. As for honorable mentions, I would probably go with The World is a Thorn and War. I think those are pretty good albums. I do think that the album War is kind of a return to form for the band, actually. And the album that came out at the same time as War Peace, I have to say I do think is one of their weakest. Now, it does have the song Recuse Myself, which is a really great song, kind of different for the band, but I find most of the album to be kind of generic for the most part. I kind of wish that they would have experimented more on that album, but it's whatever. Hopefully we'll get some more experimentation on their next album, Exile. Now, as for the latest acoustic album, Songs of Death and Resurrection, I think is good. I do think it's a solid acoustic album, but it kind of does lack replay value. There's really only a couple songs that I still return to these days, like Dead Flowers and Praise the Void, just to name a couple. But yeah, Demon Hunter all around, very solid band. Definitely an underrated band for sure. So if you're not familiar with these guys, definitely check them out. Demon Hunter, very good band for sure. So at number 1, I got to go with Trivium. Now, you can make debates on whether or not Trivium is a metalcore band, but I think if you had to place them in a genre, a subgenre, I think metalcore is pretty much the genre you want to place them in. But either way, definitely a very solid band, a really great band. Now, I think objectively, in my personal opinion, they are probably the best metalcore band. And I think the reason why I have Trivium at number 1 is for a few reasons. They do everything right with their sound. Even when they try out stuff different, it still works for the band. Now, I know some people don't like their album Silence in the Snow, which, yeah, is a little different for them. It's a little more melodic. No harsh vocals or anything like that on the album. But I think it still works for the band. I still think it's a pretty solid album. Now, yeah, it's not one of their best, but it's still a good album, though. And I think that they are the metalcore band that leans sound-wise closest to traditional heavy metal. Like, if I had to choose any band on this list, on this top 5 list, that I think is the most metal, per se, I would go with Trivium. I mean, there's no other way around it. Matt Heafy, really strong vocalist. He's got a really great voice. The guys playing instruments are also really good. Corey, Alex Bent. I mean, Alex Bent is definitely Trivium's best drummer, if not one of their best drummers. But some of my favorite albums from the band, I gotta go with Shogun, which has always been my favorite from the band. Ascendancy is also great. The Sin and the Sentence, very solid as well. And even the latest one, In the Court of the Dragon, is a very strong album as well. Even the one that came before that, What the Dead Men Say, I thought was pretty good. I mean, I don't think it's their best or anything, but I still think it's solid, though. And Trivium has no weak album, I think. So Trivium, they got to be number 1 on this list. So let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with my list? What are your favorite metalcore bands? Do you like any of these bands? Feel free to let me know. I also want to add that I do think that metalcore is a very good gateway if you're trying to get into metal. They were my gateway into metal. Some of these bands were my gateways to metal. So there is that. That is something that is worth mentioning. So that's my list, my top 5 lists. So let me know what you guys think. So with that being said, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day and take care.